nation will endure as it has endured.
Our long national nightmare is over.
Give me a break. That's a bunch of malarkey.
Hello, welcome to Planet America. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
A big show for you this week. We're going to talk to America's former number 2 diplomat in Kabul and Joe Biden's former COVID chief.
I'm going to take a deep dive into why the Biden administration was caught unprepared for a foreign policy crisis.
We're going to count down the top 5 presidents in American history.
And later we're going to be busting some more malarkey. But first...
Facing the deepest crisis of his presidency, Joe Biden is standing by his decision to end the US mission in Afghanistan.
It was time to end a 20-year war.
The comments came after 12 US Marines, 1 Navy corpsman and around 50 Afghan civilians were killed by a suicide bomber outside the gates to the Hamid Karzai International Airport in Kabul earlier today. Islamic State in Khorasan, or ISIS-K, a splinter group of the Taliban, claimed responsibility for the attack, the most deadly single strike against US forces in Afghanistan in a decade. Speaking in the East Room of the White House, President Biden made this vow.
We will not forgive. We will not forget. We will hunt you down and make you pay.
As for how America would make ISIS-K pay, President Biden wouldn't say except for this.
We will respond with force and precision at our time, at the place we choose, in the moment of our choosing.
And Biden indirectly blamed his predecessor Donald Trump for negotiating the release of prisoners he suggests were involved.
People who were freed when both those prisons were opened has been planning a complex set of attacks on the United States personnel and others.
President Biden is sticking to the deadline to complete the US withdrawal from Kabul of next Tuesday, although for a while this week he was clearly trying to push that timetable back a bit.
If there's American citizens left, we're going to stay till we get them all out.
NATO and members of the G7 also reportedly urged Biden to slow walk the final retreat until all foreign nationals and their Afghan allies who wanted to go were evacuated. But that got a swift smackdown from the Taliban.
If they are intent on continuing the occupation, so it will provoke a reaction.
So Biden dispatched America's top spy, CIA Director William Burns, to Kabul for secret talks with the de facto leader of the Taliban, Abdul Ghani Baradar, who in 2010 was arrested by the CIA in a joint operation with Pakistan, sending Baradar to jail for 8 years until President Trump ordered his release, Chaz.
I'm glad those two kids could get back together, but the deadline remained, much to the chagrin of the G7. Boris Johnson announced a few days ago that the G7 had agreed to a plan to deal with the Taliban, and the number 1 condition was that militants must allow safe passage to Afghans wanting to leave the country, even after the August 31 deadline. Well, a few hours later, Biden completely undercut that. But Johnson should be getting used to being dissed. He tried to get Biden on the phone on the Monday morning when Kabul fell, but Biden didn't respond till 10 p.m. the day after. Germany's certainly getting a sense of where they're at. The Conservative candidate to succeed Angela Merkel as Chancellor described recent events as the biggest debacle that NATO has suffered since its founding. The Allies are not thrilled, John.
Oh, shut up, Germany. Nobody's asking you. Look, the US was working on an uneasy partnership of convenience with the Taliban to identify Americans trying to make their way to the airport and to try and prevent exactly the kind of terrorist attack that we saw earlier today. Biden was asked if America was wrong to trust the Taliban.
The Taliban, they're not good guys, the Taliban. We're not suggesting that at all. But they have keen interest. As many of you have been reporting, they very much would like to figure out how to keep the airport open. They don't have the capacity to do it. And so there's a lot of reasons why they have reached out, not just to us, but to others, as to why it would be continued in their interest.
In fact, concerns over ISIS-K is one of the few things that America and the Taliban have in common at the moment. There have been reports for days that ISIS-K was planning to attack the airport with a bomb-laden truck, or suicide bombers infiltrating the crowd, or indeed mortar strikes against the airfield. And President Biden today warned there could be more to come.
That we may very well have another attack.
The other thing the US and the Taliban have in common, though, is a desire to see Americans leave Afghanistan.
Although it has been a tough evacuation. It started amongst gun battles. And that was outside the airport. And when they got that under control, then there were days of panic gridlock, where some Afghans even gave their children away in the hope that at least some of their family might escape. But for all the impediments, America's evacuated at least 82,000 people since the 14th of August, when Kabul fell. Not a bad effort, but how many Americans are left? The Secretary of State says they've evacuated about 4,500 Americans so far out of about 6,000 in the Kabul area, and they've directly contacted 500 of those remaining, leaving about 1,000 Americans who may no longer be there, or might not actually be Americans, or might want to stay. That's apparently good enough for the Democratic National Committee, who boasted President Biden defies expectations again, delivers results in Afghanistan. But the question remains, why did they only evacuate about 5,600 people between the end of July and the 14th of August, a time when the Taliban were rapidly taking over Afghanistan? And the greater the number of people that get left behind, the more they're going to be asked that very question, John.
Indeed. Well, US forces have staged a number of helicopter rescue missions, with twin-rotor Chinooks being sent outside the airport walls to try and pluck Americans from nearby hotels. But many Afghans wanting to leave are being stopped from getting anywhere near the airport, even if they hold an American passport or visa. And that could well become a sticking point for America's final withdrawal next week.
I'm here without documents because a lot of people that went to the U.S. on evacuation flights were civilians. So I thought if civilians are going and I served in the army, I should be eligible to go too.
Now, according to the Taliban, this isn't about America protecting its allies from persecution. They claim the US is trying to lure away the nation's best and brightest.
While leaving Afghanistan, the US still wants to inflict damage and loss on this nation. Every day they encourage people by telling them they will transfer them to the US and other countries and have readied their planes.
And today, President Biden was making it clear there will be Afghans who'd like to go to America who will not be able to. But for those with a visa, green card or an American passport, there is hope now beyond next week's deadline.
And after that, we're going to be in a circumstance where there will be, I believe, numerous opportunities to continue to provide access for additional persons to get out of Afghanistan.
Yeah, we'll see how hard Biden fights for those Afghan helpers. I'm reminded of a few days ago when Leave No One Behind organised the evacuation of 500 special visa holders who were considered at high risk of Taliban reprisals. These were translators, military helpers, etc. And they got inside the airport. But then they were turned back by the State Department. And we saw scenes like this for days. Afghans standing knee-deep in sewage, waving their papers at the airport gates, begging to be let in. So I hope Biden does keep faith with the Afghan helpers, especially given the Taliban scored some highfalutin devices during their recent takeover. They contain identifying biometric data, such as iris scans and fingerprints of guess who? The Afghans who assisted the Americans. So it's Biden or bust for America's helpers.
Indeed. Well, today, Chaz, we saw Joe Biden in empathy overdrive, striking the same sympathetic tone, or at least trying to, that resonated with voters in 2020. It took him less than 2 minutes, for instance, to start talking about his late son, Beau.
We have some sense, like many of you do, what the families of these brave heroes are feeling today. You get this feeling like you're being sucked into a black hole in the middle of your chest.
Familiar words there. This is a huge political test for Joe Biden, possibly a defining moment in his presidency. Will he be blamed for this failure and loss of life like Jimmy Carter was after the Eagle Claw mission to rescue the Iran hostages? Or will he be hailed as the consoler-in-chief like Ronald Reagan after Beirut and Challenger, or George W. Bush after 9/11? We'll soon find out, but so far the signs aren't good for Joe Biden. Before today's loss of life, President Biden's poll numbers had already taken a bit of a hit. His average approval rating down to 47%, according to 538.com. That is down 2.5 points in 2 weeks since the fall of Kabul. The most gruesome poll probably coming from Suffolk and USA Today, where Biden got just 41% approval. Disapproval soaring to 55%. That is Trump territory. And here's why. The same Suffolk poll gives Biden just 26% approval for his handling of Afghanistan, and contrary to the conventional wisdom that foreign policy doesn't matter to American voters at all right now, 80% say Afghanistan is very or somewhat important to them. Asked if they support the withdrawal of American troops, just over half say yes. Asked if Afghan translators should be given visas to America, an overwhelming 84% said yes. And asked if the Afghan war was worth it, 60% said no. And Biden's headaches don't end there either. Voters are worried about his handling of the economy, down to 39% approval. Approval of Biden's handling of the COVID pandemic had been up in the high 60s. It's now at 49%. Worst of all for Joe Biden, only 1 in 4 voters approve of his handling of immigration overall. The honeymoon is well and truly over. And here's the hot take on Biden's performance on Fox News this week with former Trump White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany.
Look, when President Trump was president, you didn't see crisis after crisis. You just didn't see it.
What? Either I was watching an entirely different Trump presidency, or that is some serious gaslighting right there, Chaz.
Look, there has been a bit of shamelessness on Fox recently. This was what their reporter Pete Doocy asked about negotiations with the Taliban.
Why haven't we heard the president say the United States does not negotiate with terrorists? Is that still the U.S. policy?
Weren't the Taliban the same terrorists that Trump made a deal with and tried to invite to Camp David? Spare me the righteousness. But there is an important question that does need to be answered. Why would Biden allow himself to be pushed around by the Taliban when it comes to this deadline? Congressman Dan Crenshaw put it this way: the only proper response from America to these dirty savages should be go f*** yourself. That's Congressman Dan Crenshaw. Well, it's easy for him to talk tough, but even Democrat Jason Crow agrees, albeit in a more diplomatic manner.
I'm not concerned about what the Taliban thinks we should or shouldn't do. We have an obligation to protect American citizens, and we have a moral obligation to protect our partners and friends. That's not without risk. But if we're not willing to use the United States military to protect American citizens and our friends and allies, then what are we willing to use it for?
It seems there's a simple reason that Biden's sticking to that deadline. 2 military veteran congressmen, including one Seth Moulton, snuck out to Afghanistan for some quick oversight earlier this week, and they freely admitted that they wanted to push the president to extend the August 31 deadline. But when they got there and they talked to some commanders on the ground, they realised that no matter what America does, they will not get everyone out on time, even by September 11th. So they said getting our people out depends on maintaining the current bizarre relationship with the Taliban. So Biden needs to suck up to the Taliban. If he annoys them, they could take some leftover Americans hostage, and then Biden would have some real problems. By the way, the Taliban needs America as well, because Afghanistan has run out of US dollars, and America has effectively frozen their US-held bank assets, as well as making sure the IMF halts the $450 million in funds that they were going to send to Afghanistan, and they've currently halted it. Afghanistan really needs that money. Over 75% of the previous government's budget was funded by aid money. So these two are stuck together, and America is going to have to deal with the Taliban, even given their links to Al-Qaeda. A UN report from June found that the Taliban and Al-Qaeda remain closely aligned, and maintaining a safe haven in Afghanistan continues to be a part of Al-Qaeda's strategy. At one point, Biden was trying to run with the idea that Al-Qaeda were gone, and it led to an extremely awkward exchange for the Pentagon press secretary.
What is your current estimate for how many al-Qaeda are inside Afghanistan?
We know that al-Qaeda is a presence, as well as ISIS, in Afghanistan, and we've talked about that for quite some time. We do not believe it is exorbitantly high, but we don't have an exact figure for you.
The president just said that there is no al-Qaeda presence in Afghanistan. That does not seem to be correct.
What we don't think is that what we believe is that there isn't a presence that is significant enough to merit a threat to our homeland.
Smooth. So what happens from here is anyone's guess, but we are a long, long way from Operation Enduring Freedom.
That's for sure, Chaz. Well, for more, we're pleased to have with us Annie Pforzheimer. She's a career US diplomat and former Deputy Chief of Mission at the US Embassy in Kabul. Annie Pforzheimer, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
There has been a little bit of a sense this week, Annie, that some kind of an attack against US personnel in Kabul was almost inevitable. Now we've seen it. What is your sense? Was this in any way preventable?
On the one hand, I almost think, no, it was not that preventable. ISIS is capable of carrying out these attacks under even beneficial conditions, and these were not beneficial. There were uncontrolled crowds and U.S. forces who had to be close to them. So unfortunately, no, the way that this was working out, this kind of an attack became more and more likely as time went on.
Now, the Taliban promised that remaining Americans will be free to leave afterwards. Do you trust the Taliban?
On this one particular point, I think it's credible that they would want the Americans out. Yes. I don't trust them in any other way, but in this case, I think that they want Americans to leave. They, however, are not making the important concession that Afghans who worked for us would also be allowed to leave.
President Biden said a few hours ago that there was no evidence of collusion between the Taliban and ISIS-K, that this wasn't a wave them through, allow them to attack the Americans kind of situation. Do you think that is likely, given the animosity that apparently exists between ISIS-K and the Taliban?
The animosity is hard to measure because on some level they cooperate, use the same bomb makers, use the same space. And I would say fundamentally the Taliban has allowed ISIS-K to flourish by the war that they've conducted against the US forces, against the Afghan forces. Essentially, they created a lawless environment in which ISIS-K has flourished.
What about al-Qaeda? Joe Biden's been talking about them like they're gone. They're not gone. They're partners with the Taliban. Do you feel between al-Qaeda and ISIS-K and the Taliban that we're just about to go back to square one when it comes to terrorism in Afghanistan?
I really do believe, and it is accepted information, that there are over a dozen terror groups operating right now in Afghanistan. And now they have unrestricted space in which to operate. I don't know which one of them have international ambitions, but al-Qaeda remains committed to a pursuit of its emirate, and they're still the same people who conducted the 9/11 attacks. And now they essentially have a state all to themselves.
So, Annie, we have these two missions announced by the president. One, to complete the evacuation, and then post the deadline of the 31st, for America to continue to bring Afghans with green cards and visas to the United States. But not everybody can come that wants to come, but just those with a right to come. At the same time, we're going to find the people that did this attack. How do these two now interrelate? Presumably the US doesn't want to start launching Predator drones against targets while they're trying to get Americans out of Kabul still.
I don't know. In fact, I think your point is a good one. These two missions don't work together well. To get people out, though, I will just say the important next step is the United States has to use the existing leverage it has to open up Afghanistan's airports and land borders. It's really important for humanitarian assistance to flow in and for the free movement of people. It's not only about the people who might come to the US, but Afghans who want to go to Europe or who have visas and residency in other places like India. They have to be allowed to move. Right now, Afghans are trapped inside their own borders. They've essentially been put into a giant prison camp.
You just mentioned the leverage that America has. Presumably, you're referring as much as anything to the fact that America has all their money, and they can't get any money without America's permission. Why hasn't America tried to use that leverage until now, for the last 2 weeks, while they've been negotiating about deadlines?
Well, we honestly don't know what they tried to use. I know they've been unsuccessful in most of their negotiations to date. I'll say two things. One is that America doesn't have all their money. They have most of their licit and legal money, but the Taliban has a great many sources of income that are illicit or income from other countries. The other thing is that the United States has to really accept that our tools are not strong enough unless we're acting with others. The tool of cutting off money or imposing sanctions or refusing to legally recognize the Taliban, these tools grow weaker if more and more countries peel away from them. We have to work cooperatively to make these tools stick.
There's been some debate about whether America could have started moving people out earlier without kickstarting an unwinding of Afghanistan that would have led us to the same result anyway. What's your view?
It's, to me, it's a hard question to answer because I think the premise is wrong. I think that we should not have had a deadline imposed on ourselves for our troop withdrawal. We should have told the Taliban that our withdrawal was going to happen on the timeline that we decided. And using that ambiguity, yes, we could have done better to get more people out of the country earlier. But having put that deadline on the calendar, everything we did was watched, and moving masses of people, honestly, might have accelerated an already accelerated timeline of Taliban victory.
Annie, when you hear President Biden say, effectively, my hands were tied, the options presented to me by the former administration was pull out or escalate and get back into the kind of conflict we haven't seen in, well, since the surge period of 29 and 10. Are they the only two choices that were really presented to Joe Biden this year?
I completely disagree with that premise as well. There were more than two choices. His own study group that Congress commissioned told him in February that keeping about 4,500 troops on the ground would strengthen the government's hand in negotiations and would hopefully lead to a withdrawal over just a longer timeline. And I don't think his hands were tied. The previous administration had indeed put a timeline, a deadline on withdrawal, but they also put conditions. And the Taliban had not fulfilled those conditions. As you note, they hadn't broken ties with al-Qaeda. So this president was completely free to reject the timeline of that agreement and say, we're going to take as long as we decide is necessary.
And Afghanistan's a very different country than it was when the Taliban last ran it. It's a much bigger country than it was. It's a much more developed country than it was. Are the Taliban capable of running Afghanistan today?
No, they're not. And so one of two things could happen. They could unbend and ask for help, make it clear that they would actually allow women to continue in some vital roles within this economy and essentially modernize in small increments, not past a certain point, but that they could do it that way. Unfortunately, the other option that's open to them is to break the economy and to run a country more like the one that they left behind, which had, very little industry, services, a very rudimentary economy dependent on the international community for handouts. So that's an easier country to run. And unfortunately, we don't know which of those two choices they'll make.
Annie, my final question is, as you have watched the events of the last 3 weeks unfold, given your experience in Afghanistan, are you left with a sense of this was unavoidable or this was so preventable? What is your prevailing emotion?
I feel that it was preventable. I feel frustrated and ashamed and sad. A lot of emotions. A lot of the people that I know very well in Afghanistan, some are still there. People I care about and are worried about. I'm worried about people working to save women from gender-based violence are facing violence of their own. So I feel that it was poorly decided and poorly implemented.
Annie Forsheimer, we really value your perspective on this. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we've just come off the back of a massive intelligence failure, some challenging diplomacy and a nightmarish evacuation in Kabul. But there hasn't been much attention placed on what made it all particularly hard. Here's the deal.
Yes, here's the deal.
This week, everyone's been wading to the quagmire out the front of Kabul airport, including Ted Cruz, who wrote, "It's terrifyingly clear that Joe Biden doesn't have a plan to safely evacuate all Americans from Afghanistan. They need to get one now." Well then, I'll tell you who you should call. The Assistant Secretary for Political Military Affairs. How about that? Or maybe the Assistant Secretary for Population, Refugees and Migration. They'd be good. Or how about the Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asian Affairs? Yes, that'd be nice too. Or the Assistant Secretary for Conflict and Stabilisation Operations. These are all marvellous suggestions, except none of them exist because the Senate hasn't confirmed them yet. Those 4 jobs join these 10 as positions that have nominees waiting to be confirmed that the Senate is doing absolutely nothing about. But now for another completely unrelated Ted Cruz tweet. Joe Biden is gifting Putin a generational geopolitical victory every day with his abject failure to stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I'm sorry, the what stream what? This is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It's supposed to carry natural gas from Russia to Germany, and it's almost complete. And Ted Cruz says, "I will continue to use all available leverage to force the Biden administration to implement congressionally mandated sanctions on that pipeline." And what he means when he says all available leverage is blocking those 12 nominations. Now, I know what you're thinking. Those nominees don't really have much to do with the pipeline, do they? And look, that is true, but Ted Cruz seems to be holding up as many State Department nominations as he can until the Biden administration places sanctions back on that company that's building the pipeline that Ted Cruz opposes. The net result of all that is the Senate has confirmed around 10 State Department nominees, but dozens more, including 60 would-be ambassadors, are facing what some call Cruz's death grip. Beware the power of Cruz! No, not really. But to overcome what the Senate calls a hold takes precious time that Chuck Schumer would prefer to use doing pretty much anything else that the Senate has to do. It can take multiple hours for each position. The Senate just doesn't have that sort of time. So you end up with over 24 State Department nominees just sitting in committee, not even so much as having a confirmation hearing, because what's the point? These nominees, by the way, include someone who's already been deployed to Afghanistan to help manage the evacuation effort, even though he doesn't even have an official job yet, and also the Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Research. They might have been handy a month ago, hey? And also the US Ambassador NATO, also kind of relevant to Afghanistan. And this is all just the tip of the iceberg. As of today, there have been 12 positions confirmed in the State Department out of 256. No wonder they've been screwing up. But don't hate on Ted Cruz. This is how the system works. Senators have been doing this for decades to send messages to the president. Senator Tom Cotton once tried to pressure Obama into taking punitive action over a Secret Service leak of private information by placing a hold on Obama's ambassador for the Bahamas. And he left it there for 1,647 days until the nominee died of leukemia. And this was even though he said he had enormous respect for her and her career. But he knew she was a close friend of Obama's, and he knew blocking her was a way to inflict special pain on the president. And these are just some of the examples we know about, because the Senate also allows secret holds, where the senator tells their party leader to place a hold and they never even reveal who was responsible for it. And of course, none of this stops with the State Department either. At this point in their presidencies, both Bush and Obama had had over 290 Senate appointment confirmations, around 290. But for Trump and Biden, things have slowed down quite a lot, largely because of increased obstruction. For Biden, it's even worse than it seems, because as of recently, Biden had 288 nominees still waiting confirmation, whereas Trump only had 178 waiting at the same point. Biden's trying to nominate his way out of this logjam, but it's getting worse. Although admittedly, the puns are getting better. That's very good. But it's probably time for reform, whether it be converting some Senate-confirmed appointments to non-confirmed appointments, or assigning more Senate-confirmed appointments to have fixed-length terms, or converting some political appointments to be non-political career positions. The government needs to do something, because right now, too many crucial positions are subject to the whims of senators like this guy.
Yes, and here's the deal.
Now for a COVID update, and this week there was some pretty big news.
The FDA granting full approval for Pfizer's vaccine, the fastest vaccine approval in FDA history.
Those who've been waiting for full approval should go get your shot now.
Now, the Pfizer vaccine has been available under an emergency use authorisation since December last year, and more than 200 million Pfizer shots have been administered in the US alone. But now it has full regulatory approval for patients over the age of 16, with emergency use now authorised for those aged 12 to 15.
And full approval comes with a few benefits, including permission to advertise the vaccines, as well as the ability for them to be used off-label.
Yeah. It is, although they have to do something about that name, Comirnaty or something. It's ridiculous. It's the Pfizer vaccine. But experts say that this approval should increase vaccination rates for two important reasons. First, some vaccine-hesitant people are going to be reassured this is now fully approved. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, it provides a legal shield for businesses and governments who want to impose vaccine mandates.
Like I say, the polls do suggest that first reason is true. Kaiser Foundation found that 3 in 10 of the unvaccinated would be more likely to get a COVID shot after full approval, including half of the rather large wait and see group. And as for the vaccine mandates you mentioned, Biden was up in front of those cameras at the speed of light asking employers to take advantage of the approval to impose those said mandates.
Today I'm calling on more companies, I should say, in the private sector to step up with vaccine requirements that'll reach millions more people. If you're a business leader, a nonprofit leader, a state or local leader who has been waiting for full FDA approval to require vaccinations, I call on you now to do that, require it.
This may well be the start of a period where the pressure really ramps up on the unvaccinated. Delta Airlines, for example, are about to begin charging employees on their healthcare plan a $200 monthly surcharge if they're unvaccinated. Delta's logic is that all employees who've been recently hospitalised with COVID were not fully vaccinated, and it cost Delta $50,000 per person. So they want to treat their unvaccinated employees like smokers and charge them more. By the way, note how Delta Airlines refers to the Delta variant by its scientific name, of course. Funny about that. Those employees are actually the lucky ones, though. Most healthcare plans these days don't cover coronavirus at all. Not many people know that. And so a lot of insured people are finding themselves getting hit with $50,000 bills when they get sick. If that is an incentive to get vaccinated, I don't know what is.
Yeah, well, we'll be speaking to one of America's top experts on this, the former pandemic advisor Andy Slavitt, in just a moment. But first, Chaz, you'd have to say this is a much-needed boost for the American vaccination program, given that they are being hit with this Delta variant right at a time when schools and colleges are reopening, and of course the weather is starting to cool, so a lot of those northern states, they're going back indoors.
It's a very precarious moment for America right now, with new cases at over 150,000 a day and still climbing. Hospitalisations, they seem like they've peaked, but maybe not, we'll see. Daily deaths are at over 1,000 and still climbing as well. And remember, that's all before you add Florida's last few days, which are being reported weirdly. Florida is now the only state recording not only pandemic high cases at about 26,000 a day, but pandemic high deaths as well. So they would be making a difference to the national total. Mississippi leads the pack, though, in terms of infections per capita. just in front of Florida and Louisiana, all at over 100 cases per 100,000 people a day. And the states with the least number of daily cases per 100,000 people are these. By the way, if New South Wales was an American state, it would fit just there at the bottom. A little better off than America's most COVID-free state, Maine. The stats that people really focus on, though, are these. The percentage of ICU beds that are taken. These are the states that are really struggling, with Alabama actually exceeding their beds. They have people waiting for ICU patients to die so they can take their beds. Not very pleasant. Even worse, there were 121,000 children testing positive to COVID last week, an increase of 23% from the week before, and the number of children in hospital is setting a pandemic record as well, suggesting that the Delta spike is hitting kids particularly hard. I guess it comes down to this newly approved vaccine. Is it going to do its thing? And here's your problem. You know, in Australia, we consider our vaccine rollout to be a serious problem so far.
Sure.
But if our states were American, New South Wales would be more vaccinated than 10 American states. They've had like 4 months longer than we've had, and Tasmania's ahead of 3, at least for those who have only had 1 vaccine shot. We are still behind the whole of America, though, for the fully vaccinated share of the population. Not behind them for long, though, I'd wager.
Yeah, interesting comparison. For more, we're joined by Andy Slavitt. He's a former Biden White House senior advisor for COVID response. He was also head of Medicare and Medicaid during the Obama administration, now author of the book Preventable, about America's COVID response. Andy Slavitt, welcome back to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
So how confident are you that this FDA approval of the Pfizer vaccine is going to increase vaccination rates significantly?
Well, it should. What it really communicates is that you're really one of the gold standard bodies in the world, reviewed over 300,000 pages of submission, more data than has ever been reviewed on any vaccine in the history of vaccines, and has determined that the vaccine is not only highly effective, but very well tolerated. And I think for people who've been on the fence about whether they should take a vaccine or not, this should be very encouraging news.
The number of children with COVID and the number of children in hospital with COVID is continuing to rise. So are we at the point now where we can say for sure that the Delta strain affects children more and worse than previous strains of COVID?
Well, look, it's a more infectious variant, so it affects us all more. You know, there's 180,000 cases reported among kids every week now. It's up about 4-fold. About somewhere between 0.5% and 2% of them are getting hospitalized. That's serious. During the times of polio, about 1% of kids with polio got some form of paralysis. So very similar. The number of percentage of cases get turned serious. So this is a real problem. Anybody who wants to pretend that kids aren't at risk, try having to take your kid to the hospital 5 years old when they're short of breath, can't breathe, wheezing, and with 105 temperature. That's usually something we care about in this country, and it's usually something that would cause us to want to get vaccinated to dramatically reduce the likelihood the kids are going to get sick. We're not doing it. We need to do it.
A couple of months ago at the start of your summer, there was a feeling this pandemic was all but over. Delta changed all of that, of course. Do you think that that is now the pattern for the future? We're just going to keep getting new, potentially more deadly variants, some that could be vaccine resistant as well?
Well, to put that in perspective, here in 2021, we're still dealing with variants from the 1918 flu. Very few viruses are eradicated. Smallpox is quite an exception. And there are tens of thousands of viruses in the history of the world. Most of them are not notable because they don't disrupt our lives, or they minimally disrupt our lives. They very rarely hospitalize people. This one hospitalizes people. But with enough vaccination, with enough with an antiviral, which would be quite important. And with enough people getting vaccinated around the globe, we can bring this to a place where it's a manageable challenge. It doesn't have to be eliminated for us to go on with our lives. It just has to be something we know how to manage. And we have many of the tools today to do this. We've got to use them.
We're now seeing a lot of hospitals that have 0 ICU beds available. So what happens in those hospitals when a new critical patient turns up? Do they try to service that patient in a normal bed, or do they have to airlift them to somewhere else?
Well, it sort of depends. They have a couple of options. They do try to retrofit more beds with more nurses and with oxygen and with ventilation to be able to accommodate more patients when they can. But oftentimes it means that you've got very crowded emergency rooms. It means that more people get sent home that would otherwise be hospitalized. That's happening all across the country. And it means that people are reluctant to go to hospitals, both for COVID and for other things that they might need to go to the hospital for. The reality is that, the system can't function well when that happens. And of course, if you're in a situation where you're in a rural part of the country, then you really do have to consider airlifting patients to other hospitals because you can get overwhelmed quite quickly.
Right now, we're seeing Americans become eligible for their third COVID shot, a booster shot, at a time when 95% of people on the continent of Africa have not had their first and second shots to become fully vaccinated. How do you make that calculation as someone who's recently come from the White House as to what do you do about Americans, what do you do about the rest of the world to stop the risk of another Delta variant hitting you as well?
So right now, the plan put forward by the G7 is to vaccinate 70% of the globe by the end of 2022. And that's just simply too long. So what we need to do is we need to commit as wealthy countries to vaccinate the globe, 70% of the globe, 9 months earlier, by March of 2022, or about 9 months from now, eight or 9 months from now. That needs to be the goal. If we can do that, and the US needs to be part of leading the way, there's no question about it, then we can boost people who need them. And the truth is, there are extra vaccines already in states that can't be used for export, that can be used to boost, number one. And number two, the manufacturers can produce enough to get to that goal. The bigger challenge is probably not going to be production. It's going to be distribution. It's going to be logistics. It's going to be the regulatory hurdles. It's going to be cold chain storage in the Republic of the Congo. It's going to be getting vaccines to remote corners of Azerbaijan. It's going to be using all of our assets across the world and coordinating them. And not for nothing, it's going to take the US, China, and Russia, all of whom are big vaccine manufacturers, to do some collaboration. And we know right now that's not happening. So we have to set us a very aggressive goal to vaccinate the globe. We have to coordinate around the world to do that. We need to make that the top priority. And presuming that once we are confident we can do that, I think we'll see that that adding boosters where needed to countries that have been vaccinated early can probably still be done. But that's a commitment that we have to make.
Now, Andy, last year we saw Florida have a big wave in the hotter parts of the year when they all stay indoors. And that was followed by the northern states having their own big wave during the colder parts of the year when they all stay indoors. Well, now Florida is having an even bigger wave again during the hotter parts of the year again. Are you concerned that the northern states are going to have their own even bigger wave still in a few months' time?
Absolutely. And look, people can be critical of Governor DeSantis' response, and I am critical of his response, to be clear. But Governor DeSantis didn't cause the virus to travel to Florida. Events beyond his control or anybody's control did. So while he could have responded better, we shouldn't conflate that with thinking that somehow states that have not seen the surge that Florida has seen aren't going to see it. Even well-vaccinated states like California and New York have significant pockets of unvaccinated people. And those communities in particular are very ripe for outbreaks. And so every state has the opportunity, unfortunately, to go through the same thing Florida's going through at any given moment, but particularly as things get colder in the northern part of the U.S., it will mean people being indoors more, and that will increase the spread.
Andy Slavitt, thanks for your time again.
Thanks for having me.
Last week, we started counting down the top 10 presidents of all time in the United States, as voted by a panel of historians and experts using a set of 10 leadership criteria. The voice of ABC TV's Countdown, Gavin Wood, is back to announce the 5 best. But first, a quick recap.
Coming in at number 10 this week, Barack Obama. Steady at number 9, President Ronald Reagan. Number 8, John F. Kennedy. Number 7, Thomas Jefferson. Coming in at number 6, Harry S. Truman. Heading into the top 5 now, and it's Dwight D. Eisenhower.
How much is that dog in the window?
Yep, the historians sure like Ike, the sometimes overlooked overseer of the prosperous and peaceful 1950s, has moved up 4 places in 20 years.
America has shown her confidence in Eisenhower.
The former Allied Supreme Commander in World War II combined moral authority with administrative skills. He was courted by both sides of politics before he ran as a Republican, but he governed from the centre and worked well with a Democratic Congress. He just lacked a little bit of vision. Probably the reason why he's sometimes still forgotten today.
This week at number 4, Won't You Be My Teddy Bear? It's Teddy Roosevelt.
One of the great reformers, progressive Republican Theodore Roosevelt, was a bundle of contradictions. Conservationist and big game hunter, the first president to invite a black man to dinner at the White House, he was also a believer in white racial supremacy. He was a sickly child who grew into an outdoorsman who wrestled White House staff for fun, and a war hero who won the Nobel Peace Prize. What a guy. He gets the highest marks for public persuasion, crisis leadership, economic management and international relations, and only drops out of the top 10 on one count. Equal justice for all. He really was a bit of a racist.
Let's keep it all in the family, like Johnny and Marie. At number 3, it's Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Fifth cousin to Teddy, FDR also set his sights on the White House, and not even paralysis from polio could stop him. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal lifted America out of the Great Depression, and his leadership took the Allies to the brink of victory in World War II before his health finally failed. He takes the #1 spot in public persuasion, all those fireside chats.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking.
And international relations as well. He's top 3 on every other score except equal justice. With everything else going on, civil rights just wasn't a top priority.
After 12,119 weeks in the charts, steady at number 2, it's President George Washington.
It must be nice, it must be nice to have Washington on your side.
America's first president was the hero of the Revolutionary War and set the standard for probity and humility by which all future presidents have been judged. The father of the nation, he established institutions including the First National Bank and the Supreme Court. The historians scored Washington top or second top by most measures. Down a little on public persuasion. No great orator, to be sure. His speeches were spare and often read by the public rather than generally heard. And he's down at 14th for the pursuit of equal justice because, again, he owned slaves.
To have Washington on your side.
And now, here's your number 1, and I can't say more than Honest Abe Lincoln.
Without Abraham Lincoln, there may very well not be a United States of America. His election triggered the southern state secession and the Civil War that became a fight for the freedom of people living as slaves. Lincoln tops this poll of historians by a wide margin. Number 1 in 7 of the 10 categories. His highest score is for crisis leadership, vision, agenda setting and moral authority. And it's hard to argue with that.
I would argue, but I want to come back next week. This is Gavin Wood speaking. Good night, Planet America.
And I am pleased to say that Gavin will be back next week when we'll start counting down the 10 worst presidents in American history. So do yourself a favour and don't miss that. But first, malarkey.
That's a bunch of malarkey.
Oh, it's good to be back in the no malarkey zone, Chaz. And a funny thing happened at a campaign-style rally by former President Donald Trump in Cullman, Alabama last weekend. He encouraged his supporters to take the COVID vaccine. And then something even funnier happened. Trump loyalists booed him. Take a look.
I recommend take the vaccines. I did it. It's good. Take the vaccines. But you got, no, that's okay. That's all right. You got your freedoms. But I happen to take the vaccine.
So, far from full-throated, not like he was advocating bleach, internal lighting and anti-malarial drugs for COVID, but not bad for him. Still, long-time Trump supporter and conspiracy theorist Alex Jones was far from happy. Jones has been telling his listeners vaccines don't work and they're basically designed to create a race of mutants.
Because you got lied to, Trump. It didn't have 98% efficacy. We knew day one it wouldn't work, period. It's a fraud. It'll create mutants. You got chumped. You got signed on to a fraud to restart the economy. I understand why you did it. You believe in science. Except these are bad actors, sir. You believed America could produce a good vaccine. Of course they could have. They didn't want to. They didn't create a vaccine. They created a Frankenstein.
And now Trump's a mutant?
I guess by that logic, huge if true. But look, the crazies aren't just on internet radio. They're also in Congress, of course, like Marjorie Taylor Greene.
I'm completely against masks. They don't work. They're not stopping the spread of COVID. I'm also completely against forced vaccines. The vaccines are failing.
Quick fact check on that. Masks do reduce the spread of COVID and vaccines are not failing or causing a race of mutants. Marjorie Taylor Greene, though, being at the Iowa State Fair, that drew a little bit of attention this week, Chaz, because the Iowa State Fair is famously one of the first stops for potential presidential candidates. A truly terrifying thought and malarkey.
Oh God, get me off this ride. While we're in the malarkey zone, we haven't played this for a while. Tucker and his guest JD Vance were not happy about Afghan refugees.
40% of Afghans believe that suicide bombing is a reasonable way to solve a problem. Who wants people like that in their community? Of course, 60% of Afghans don't believe that, but when you're not vetting people properly, you're going to get a lot of bad people in your communities. So let's just be honest about the fact that if we want to have a real country, we need to make sure that good people are coming into this country. There are ways to help the Afghans who really did help our military without sending tens of thousands of unvetted people into our country.
JD wasn't the only one asking these questions. Donald Trump has moved on a bit since last week when he loved Afghan refugees. Now he's suggesting that we can only imagine how many thousands of terrorists have been airlifted into neighbourhoods around the world. No vetting, he shouted. How many terrorists will Joe Biden bring to America? Well, let me put your mind at ease, Mr. President. In all likelihood, it will be 0 terrorists because only American citizens and Afghans who have gone through the special immigration visa process are coming to America. That is the exhaustive 14-step process that they have to follow, which includes a proof of employment, a letter of recommendation, proof of being threatened and interviewed, fingerprints and the rest. Those who have not completed the special immigration visa process are being evacuated to other countries. So rest easy, conservatives. You'd think they could back off a bit. The Afghan refugees have had a pretty hard month.
Yeah, it feels like we saw this movie about 20 years ago, Chaz, and I didn't like it then either. But that's your lot for another week. We'll see you back here for another trip to Planet America at the same time next week or whenever you like on ABC iView, Facebook and YouTube.
Sadly, no pet podcast available today with all the commotion in Kabul, but I will try to get one out to you early next week. See you later.
Bye-bye.